The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Vextai adjusted the containment field around the transport cage. 23 alien students from across the Galactic Educational Consortium sat in tiered seating, their various appendages fidgeting with anticipation. Today's xenobiology lesson promised to be memorable. "Class, observe carefully," Professor Vextai announced, his crystalline voice echoing through the chamber. The Zephyrian's translucent blue skin shimmered as he gestured toward the cage with one of his forearms. "Today we examine a live specimen of one of the galaxy's most feared predator species." The cage hummed ominously, its energy barriers crackling with contained power. Inside, a figure sat hunched in the corner, barely visible through the swirling containment mist. The students leaned forward, compound eyes, optical sensors, and various other visual organs straining to get a better look. The species designation is Homo sapiens, commonly known as humans, Vextai continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a dramatic whisper. Native to the third planet of the Sol system, these creatures are responsible for some of the most brutal conflicts in recent galactic history. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. Even the Caraxian student, whose species was known for their aggressive territorial disputes, seemed to shrink back in his seat. The humans' reputation had spread far across the stars. Tales of their savagery whispered in the darkest corners of space stations and trading posts. Marcus Chun sat in the back row, trying to keep his expression neutral as his professor continued the lecture about his own species. Being the only human enrolled in the Galactic Educational Consortium had its challenges, but this was perhaps the most surreal moment yet. He watched as his classmates recoiled in fear at descriptions of human pack hunting behavior and unprecedented aggression toward other sapient species. "Note the binocular vision," Professor Vextai pointed out, somehow managing to make it sound sinister. "Evolved from pursuit predators, humans can track prey across vast distances. Their forward-facing eyes indicate a species designed for hunting rather than grazing." The herbivorous student in the front row actually whimpered at this, her leaf-like appendages rustling with terror. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for both his classmate and the figure in the cage. He wondered how they had managed to capture a human, and, more importantly, whether this person knew they were being used as a living nightmare fuel for alien students. But, perhaps most terrifying of all, the professor continued, warming to his subject, is their psychological makeup. Humans are one of the few species known to engage in warfare, not for resources or territory, but for abstract concepts like honor and ideology. They will fight to the death for ideas that exist only in their minds. This drew horrified gasps from several students. The rationalist student, whose species prided itself on pure logic, seemed particularly disturbed by this revelation. Marcus could practically see the gears turning in his elongated cranium as he tried to process the concept of dying for something intangible. The containment field flickered, and, for a moment, the figure inside became clearer. Marcus caught a glimpse of a young woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing what looked like a standard civilian jumpsuit. She had dark hair and appeared to be injured, favoring her left arm. But what struck him most was her eyes. They weren't the cold, predatory gaze that Vextai was describing. They looked scared, confused, and very, very alone. "The specimen before you was captured during the recent conflict in the Outer Rim," Vextai explained. "Intelligence reports suggest she is a civilian, but, as we know, all humans are potential combatants. Their entire society is built around conflict preparation." Marcus felt his jaw clench. He knew the conflict in the Outer Rim the professor was referring to. It hadn't been a human aggression at all, but a desperate defense of a small colony that had been attacked by raiders. The human response had been swift and effective, yes, but it had been entirely justified. Apparently, the survivors were now being treated as specimens for academic study. "Now, observe her behavioral patterns," the professor instructed, manipulating the containment field to create a low-frequency hum that clearly distressed the captive. Note how she immediately shifts into a defensive posture. Humans are always ready for combat, even when severely outnumbered and contained. The woman in the cage had indeed moved, pressing herself against the far wall and looking around warily. But to Marcus, she didn't look ready for combat. She looked terrified and trying to find an escape route, which seemed like a perfectly reasonable response to being caged and experimented on. Professor, one of the braver students spoke up, a tentacled being whose species was known for their scientific curiosity. Is it true that humans can survive in environments that would kill most other species? Ah, excellent question, Xyloth, Vextai beamed. Indeed, humans evolved on what we would classify as a death world. Extreme temperature variations, violent weather patterns, toxic atmospheric conditions in some regions, and gravity that would crush most civilized species. This harsh environment created their aggressive nature and remarkable adaptability. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. While it was true that Earth was considered a high-gravity, variable climate world by galactic standards, describing it as a death world seemed a bit extreme. Then, again, he supposed it was all a matter of perspective. What seemed normal to him might indeed appear hellish to species that had evolved on more stable planets. They can survive in near-vacuum conditions for short periods, the professor continued, consume foods that would poison other species, and their healing factor is remarkably accelerated compared to most sapient life. Some reports even suggest they can regenerate entire organ systems given time. That last part was definitely an exaggeration, Marcus thought, though he supposed the human liver's regenerative properties might seem miraculous to species with less robust biology. He made a mental note to correct some of these misconceptions in his next xenobiology essay, assuming he could do so without revealing his own species. The lecture continued with increasingly dramatic descriptions of human capabilities. Vextai described their ability to enter berserker states during combat, their pack-bonding tendencies that made them willing to die for complete strangers, and their disturbing habit of keeping other species as pets, a concept that seemed to particularly horrify the more independent-minded species in the class. Throughout it all, Marcus watched the woman in the cage. She had stopped looking around wildly and was now sitting very still, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Occasionally, she would glance toward the back of the room, and Marcus got the unsettling feeling that she might be looking directly at him. When the lecture finally ended, the students filed out quickly, clearly eager to put distance between themselves and the terrifying human specimen. Professor Vextai sealed the containment unit and prepared to transport it to whatever holding facility they were using. Marcus lingered, pretending to organize his notes while actually trying to figure out what he should do. As the last student left, and Vextai stepped out to coordinate with the security team, Marcus found himself alone in the lecture hall with the caged human. The containment field hummed quietly, and the woman inside looked up at him with eyes that were definitely focused and aware. "You're not like the others," she said quietly, her voice barely audible through the energy barrier. "You smell different." Marcus froze. The translator systems in the classroom were sophisticated, but the fact that she was speaking in perfect galactic standard suggested she was far more than the primitive specimen Vextai had described. More concerning was her comment about smell. Human olfactory capabilities weren't supposed to be sophisticated enough to distinguish between different alien species at this distance. "I know you can understand me," she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Human, right? You've been sitting still the whole time while everyone else was fidgeting. Only humans can stay that motionless when they're thinking hard." Marcus glanced toward the door, then made a decision that would change everything. He approached the containment unit, keeping his voice low. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The relief that flooded her face was immediate and profound. "Thank the stars," she breathed. "I thought I was going to die in here. They've been keeping me drugged, but the effects are wearing off. My name is Sarah Chun, and before you ask, yes, we're probably related if you're running around the galaxy with that surname." Marcus almost smiled despite the circumstances. Chun was indeed a common enough surname that they could easily be distant cousins. I'm Marcus. What happened to you? Raiders hit our colony, Sarah explained quickly, glancing toward the door. We fought back, and when the consortium ships arrived, they found us standing over the bodies. They assumed we were the aggressors and took survivors for study. I've been in various labs and holding cells for 3 months now. 3 months. Marcus felt sick. They've been studying humans for 3 months? Not just studying, Sarah said grimly. They're trying to figure out how to fight us. Every test, every examination, every psychological evaluation, it's all been focused on finding weaknesses they can exploit. They're terrified of us, Marcus, and scared people do terrible things. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Sarah quickly resumed her hunched, defeated posture while Marcus pretended to be reviewing his notes. Professor Vextai returned with 2 security guards, their imposing forms making the lecture hall feel suddenly smaller. Mr. Chun, Vextai said, noticing Marcus still there. I trust the lecture was enlightening. Very much so, Professor, Marcus replied, hoping his voice sounded steady. I was just reviewing my notes on human behavioral patterns. Fascinating how they can appear docile when contained but remain fundamentally dangerous. Vextai seemed pleased by this response. Indeed. Remember, their capacity for deception is legendary. Never trust a human to be what they appear to be. The irony was not lost on Marcus as he gathered his materials and left the lecture hall. As he walked down the corridor, his mind raced with implications. If Sarah was right, if the consortium was actively studying humans to develop weapons against them, then the fragile peace between humanity and the galactic community was in serious jeopardy. More immediately, he had a fellow human trapped and suffering just a few hundred meters away, and he was possibly the only person in this entire sector of space who could help her. But helping her would mean revealing his own identity, which could compromise not just his education, but potentially humanity's position in the galactic community. As he reached his dormitory, Marcus made another decision that would prove even more consequential than the first. He opened his personal communication terminal and began composing a message to the one person he trusted above all others, his older sister, Admiral Jennifer Chun of the Human Defense Fleet. But first, he needed to find a way to get back to Sarah without arousing suspicion. As the only human in the program, his continued interest in the specimen would eventually be noticed. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Outside his window, the stars of the Andromeda Educational Station sparkled against the void, beautiful and cold. Somewhere among those stars, other humans lived their lives in blissful ignorance of the fact that their species was being systematically studied by potential enemies. That ignorance was about to end one way or another. Marcus pulled up the academic schedule on his terminal. Professor Vextai's next demonstration was scheduled for tomorrow, and it was listed as Advanced Human Behavioral Studies, Stress Response Testing. His blood ran cold. Whatever they were planning to do to Sarah tomorrow, it wasn't going to be another passive observation session. Time was running out. Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to steady his nerves. The Human Defense Fleet emergency communication protocols were designed for exactly this kind of situation, but using them would create a transmission signature that consortium monitoring systems might detect. Still, Admiral Chun needed to know what was happening here. He activated the concealed quantum communicator built into his student identification chip, a precaution that had seemed paranoid when his sister insisted on it 6 months ago. Now it might be the only thing standing between Sarah and whatever stress response testing the professor had planned. The message was brief and coded. Academic research taking unexpected direction. Local specimen requires immediate consultation. Situation developing rapidly. Please advise soonest. While waiting for a response, Marcus made his way to the station's central library, ostensibly to research his upcoming xenobiology assignment. In reality, he needed to learn everything he could about the station's security systems and detention protocols. The Andromeda Educational Station was massive, housing nearly 50,000 students and faculty from across the galaxy. Security was handled by a joint consortium of different species forces, which meant coordination was often slow and bureaucratic. That might work in their favor. Mr. Chun. Marcus looked up from his terminal to see Dr. Kethril approaching, her 6 legs carrying her arachnoid form with surprising grace. The Silken Professor taught advanced ethics and had always been friendly to him, though he'd never been certain how much she suspected about his true nature. Dr. Kethril, he replied, closing his research files. Working late on the new curriculum review. Indeed, though I must say, Professor Vextai's latest addition to the xenobiology program troubles me. She settled into the chair across from him, her large compound eyes reflecting concern. Using live, sapient specimens for education seems ethically questionable. Marcus felt a spark of hope. You've seen the human prisoner? Prisoner? Dr. Kethril's antennae twitched with surprise. Is that what they're calling her? The documentation I reviewed listed her as a volunteer research participant, though the circumstances of her recruitment were notably vague. Volunteer? Marcus almost laughed bitterly. Did you read Professor Vextai's background notes on how she was acquired? Dr. Kethril's expression darkened. I'm beginning to suspect there are significant details I haven't been provided. The Ethics Review Board was told this was a standard cultural exchange program with full consent from all parties. Marcus made a quick decision. Dr. Kethril, hypothetically speaking, if you discover that a research subject was being held against their will, what would be the proper protocol? Hypothetically, she said carefully, I would be required to file an immediate ethics violation report and demand a full investigation. The subject would be placed in protective custody, pending review. Why do you ask? Before Marcus could respond, his communication chip vibrated with an incoming message. Admiral Chen's reply was characteristically direct. Deploying assets to your location. Maintain current cover. Do not attempt direct action until support arrives. ET, 18 hours. 18 hours. Marcus glanced at his chronometer. The stress response testing was scheduled to begin in 12 hours. Dr. Kethril, he said quietly, I think we need to have a very serious conversation about Professor Vextai's research methods. An hour later, they sat in Dr. Kethril's private office while she reviewed the actual documentation about Sarah's capture and detention. Her compound eyes grew wider with each page, and her mandibles clicked with increasing agitation. This is outrageous, she finally said. This female was captured during a defensive action against pirates. Her colony was the victim, not the aggressor. And these medical reports, they've been conducting invasive procedures without proper consent protocols. What can you do? Marcus asked. I'm filing the ethics violation report immediately. But you understand, Mr. Chun, that bureaucratic processes move slowly. Even with urgent priority, it could take days for the review board to convene and make a decision. She doesn't have days. They're planning stress response testing tomorrow morning. Dr. Kethril's expression became grim. Stress response testing on an unwilling sapient subject. That's not research. That's torture. I'll contact station security immediately. As Dr. Kethril activated her communication system, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Help was coming from multiple directions now, but would arrive in time? Meanwhile, 3 levels down in the research detention block, Sarah Chun was conducting her own form of investigation. The sedatives they'd been giving her had definitely weakened over the past few days, and her enhanced human metabolism was processing them faster than her captors realized. She'd been listening carefully to the conversations of her guards, piecing together fragments of galactic standard and building a clearer picture of her situation. What she'd learned was disturbing. The consortium wasn't just studying humans out of academic curiosity. They were actively preparing for what they saw as an inevitable conflict. Through careful observation, she'd mapped the guard rotation schedules, identified the locations of surveillance sensors, and noted that the containment field had a brief power fluctuation every 6 hours during the automated system maintenance cycle. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. The real breakthrough had come when she'd recognized the voice of a young man from the lecture hall. A human voice, speaking perfect galactic standard. She wasn't alone on this station after all. As the station's lights dimmed to simulate night's cycle, Sarah began implementing a plan she'd been developing since her capture. The maintenance staff would arrive in 3 hours for their routine inspection. If she timed everything perfectly, she might be able to create enough confusion to escape her immediate confinement and find the other human. Dr. Kethral's emergency call to station security had triggered its own set of complications. Security Chief Valorax, a gruff Turian with little patience for academic politics, listened to her concerns with growing irritation. "Professor, with respect, this sounds like an interdepartmental dispute that should be handled through proper channels," he growled through the communicator. "I can't just storm into a legitimate research facility based on allegations of improper documentation. Chief Valorax, I'm telling you that an innocent sapient is being held against their will and subjected to harmful experimentation. That's not an academic dispute, it's a crime. And I'm telling you that Professor Vextai has all the proper authorization from the Consortium Research Authority. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, file it with the appropriate oversight committee." Dr. Kethral clicked off the communication in frustration. Marcus, who had been listening from across the room, felt his heart sink. Bureaucracy was going to kill Sarah as surely as any weapon. "There has to be another way," he said. "I'm afraid our options are limited," Dr. Kethral replied. "Unless we can find evidence of immediate physical danger, security won't act without proper authorization." What would constitute immediate physical danger? Medical emergency, escape attempt, threat to station safety? She paused, looking at Marcus with sudden understanding. "You're thinking of doing something reckless, aren't you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Dr. Kethral, how much do you know about human psychology?" "Probably more than I should, given your species' reputation." "Why?" "Because humans have a saying, sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. We're not always rational when someone we care about is in danger." Dr. Kethral's antennae drooped. "Mr. Chun, please tell me you're not planning to do anything that might validate Professor Vextai's theories about human aggression." "I'm planning to save someone who doesn't deserve what's happening to her. If that validates his theories, so be it." Before Dr. Kethral could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors in an ominous glow, and the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, all personnel. We have a security breach in Research Block C. All students are to remain in their quarters until further notice." Security teams respond immediately. Marcus and Dr. Kethral looked at each other with dawning realization. She didn't wait for rescue. Marcus said with a mixture of admiration and concern. The escape had begun exactly as Sarah had planned. The maintenance worker who entered her cell during the power fluctuation had been expecting a drugged, docile specimen. Instead, he'd encountered a fully alert human female with 3 months of suppressed anger and desperation. Sarah had disabled him quickly and quietly, using techniques that would have impressed even her military relatives. Human close-quarters combat training emphasized speed and efficiency, and the maintenance worker species had evolved on a low-gravity world that made them poorly suited to resist human-level force. She now wore his uniform and carried his security credentials, though she doubted the disguise would fool anyone for long. Her immediate goal was to reach the student quarters and find Marcus before security locked down the entire station. The corridors of Research Block C were a maze of laboratories and holding cells, many of them containing specimens from other primitive species that the consortium was studying. Sarah felt a pang of guilt at leaving them behind, but her escape window was measured in minutes, not hours. She made it to the main elevator shaft before encountering her first real obstacle: 2 security guards posted at the lift controls. They were Caraxians, the aggressive species that had seemed so intimidated by humans during the lecture. Up close, they were even more imposing, with thick, chitinous armor and razor-sharp claws. "Halt!" one of them commanded as she approached. "This area is under lockdown. Return to your assigned station." Sarah kept walking, her hands raised in apparent surrender. "There's been an accident in Lab 7, she said in her best maintenance worker voice. Dr. Vextai needs immediate assistance. The guards exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She struck with the same swift efficiency she'd used on the maintenance worker, though the Caraxian's natural armor made the task considerably more challenging. When the brief struggle was over, she had 2 unconscious guards and access to the elevator system. More importantly, she had their weapons, energy pistols that would level the playing field considerably if she encountered more resistance. As the elevator rose toward the student quarters, Sarah allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Professor Vextai had been right about one thing. Humans were indeed dangerous when cornered. He just hadn't understood that their real strength wasn't in their aggression, but in their refusal to give up when fighting for something important. The student quarter levels were in chaos as security teams tried to implement lockdown procedures while confused students demanded explanations. Sarah slipped through the confusion with practiced stealth, following the dormitory directories toward her goal. Marcus's room was on level 15, section C. As she made her way through the corridors, Sarah couldn't help but notice the mix of species around her. The galactic community was incredibly diverse, and in other circumstances, she might have found the experience fascinating rather than terrifying. She found Marcus's room and activated the door chime. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the door slid open to reveal the young man from the lecture hall. His eyes widened as he took in her stolen uniform and improvised weapons. "We need to talk," Sarah said simply. "And we need to do it fast." Marcus stepped aside to let her in, his mind racing with implications. Sarah's escape had just changed everything. Whatever Admiral Chen's planned response had been, it was about to become much more complicated. "How much do you know about human military protocols?" Sarah asked as soon as the door sealed behind them. "Enough to know that Admiral Chen is going to be very unhappy about this situation," Marcus replied. Sarah blinked in surprise. "Admiral Jennifer Chen? She's your contact." "She's my sister." "Well," Sarah said with a tired smile, "this just got interesting, because I'm pretty sure that about 5 minutes ago, I just started a diplomatic incident that could affect human consortium relations for the next century." Outside Marcus's window, the running lights of approaching ships became visible against the stars. Admiral Chen's response fleet had arrived early, and they were about to find a situation that was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Jennifer Chen stood on the bridge of the HDF Prometheus, watching the Andromeda educational station grow larger on the main display. Her expression remained calm and professional, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the command rail. Getting her brother's coded message had been alarming enough. Arriving to find the station in full security alert with multiple ships surrounding it was significantly worse. "Admiral," Commander Torres reported from the tactical station, "I'm reading consortium vessels from 6 different species. 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and what appears to be a science ship. They're maintaining defensive positions around the station. Any response to our approach? Station Control is demanding we identify ourselves and state our business. The consortium fleet is curious, but not immediately hostile." Jennifer nodded. The situation was delicate. Humanity's membership in the Galactic Consortium was still relatively new, and their reputation as a dangerous species made every interaction politically significant. Whatever was happening on that station, she needed to handle it with extreme care. "Open a channel to Station Control," she ordered. "This is Admiral Jennifer Chen of the Human Defense Fleet. I'm responding to reports of a human citizen requiring assistance. I request immediate communication with Station Administrator Veltar." While waiting for a response, she opened a private channel to her intelligence officer. "Commander Park, what do we know about the educational station's current status?" "Ma'am, our long-range sensors detected a security breach approximately 20 minutes ago. Multiple unauthorized personnel movements, weapon discharges, and what appears to be a fighting withdrawal from the research levels to the student quarters. At least 3 casualties reported, though none appear fatal." Jennifer felt her stomach tighten. Marcus was supposed to be maintaining his cover, not engaging in combat operations. Unless he wasn't the one doing the fighting. Ma'am, the communications officer interrupted. I have Station Administrator Veltar on the line. He seems agitated. Put him through. The main screen flickered to reveal a tall, thin alien with silvery skin and multiple arms. Administrator Veltar's expression was a mixture of fear and barely controlled anger. Admiral Chun, he began without preamble. I demand an explanation for your presence here. One of your species has committed multiple violent crimes aboard my station and is currently holding hostages in the student quarters. Jennifer kept her voice level. Administrator, I'm going to need specific details about what's occurred. What human are you referring to, and what are these alleged crimes? The research specimen that Professor Vextai was using for educational demonstrations escaped her containment 3 hours ago. She has assaulted multiple staff members, stolen security equipment, and is now barricaded in a student dormitory with at least one hostage. My security forces are preparing to storm the position. Every word sent a chill down Jennifer's spine. Research specimen. Educational demonstrations. They had captured and caged a human being for academic study. Administrator, she said, her voice taking on a dangerously quiet tone. I'm going to need you to repeat that. Did you say you were holding a human citizen as a research specimen? Veltar seemed oblivious to the warning signs in her voice. Of course, the Consortium Research Authority approved the study of primitive aggressive species. The human was captured during a legitimate police action and has been providing valuable data about your species' behavioral patterns. Behind Jennifer, she heard Commander Torres whisper something that was probably not regulation appropriate. She held up a hand for silence while processing the full implications of what she'd just heard. Administrator, I need to speak with this human immediately, and I need you to order your security forces to stand down until we can resolve the situation diplomatically. Absolutely not, Veltar replied firmly. This creature has already demonstrated the violent tendencies we've been documenting. Allowing her to continue her rampage would validate every concern the Consortium has about human membership in civilized society. Jennifer closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. What happened in the next few hours would determine humanity's relationship with the galactic community for generations to come. Commander Torres, she said quietly, prepare a boarding party. Full diplomatic escort protocols, but armed for potential hostile response. Ma'am, Torres responded, should I include the Special Operations Team? Not yet. Let's see if we can resolve this without confirming every paranoid fantasy these people have about humans. In Marcus's dormitory room, Sarah was rapidly explaining the situation while keeping one eye on the corridor outside. The sounds of approaching security teams were growing closer, and she estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before the room was breached. The research they've been conducting goes far beyond simple observation, she told Marcus urgently. They've been testing human pain responses, psychological breaking points, and combat capabilities under different conditions. Everything they're learning is being fed directly to military planning committees. Marcus felt sick. They're preparing to fight us. Worse than that, they're trying to figure out how to defeat us without having to fight us at all. Psychological warfare, biological agents, environmental manipulations. They see humans as an existential threat to galactic stability. Are we? Sarah paused in her preparations to look at him seriously. Honestly, maybe. We're incredibly aggressive compared to most galactic species. We breed fast, adapt quickly, and we're not afraid to fight impossible odds. From their perspective, we probably look like a plague waiting to spread across the galaxy. So what do? We prove them wrong, Sarah said simply. We show them that humans can be reasonable, cooperative, and peaceful, even when we're scared and cornered and have every reason to lash out. The door chime rang, followed immediately by a loud voice in the corridor. Attention occupants. This is station security. Open the door and come out with your hands visible. You have 30 seconds to comply. Marcus looked at Sarah, who was checking the charge on her stolen energy pistol. What if they're not interested in seeing our peaceful side? Then we improvise, she replied. But, Marcus, whatever happens, don't let them provoke you into doing something that confirms their worst fears about us. The future of human consortium relations might depend on how we handle the next few minutes. Dr. Kethrel arrived at the security checkpoint just as the armed teams were preparing to breach Marcus's room. She had been trying to reach the confrontation site for over an hour, but the lockdown procedures had made movement nearly impossible. "Chief Valorax," she called out, "I need to speak with you before you proceed." The Turian security chief turned with visible irritation. "Professor, this is not the time for academic discussions. We have a dangerous situation that requires immediate resolution." "That's exactly what I need to discuss with you," Kethrel insisted. "I've completed my review of the human detention documentation. What Professor Vextai has been doing constitutes multiple violations of consortium law regarding the treatment of sapient beings. Even if that's true, it doesn't justify the violence this creature has committed. Chief, the human female was defending herself against unlawful imprisonment and torture. Under consortium law, she has the right to use reasonable force to escape illegal detention." Valorax paused, his mandibles clicking with uncertainty. "Are you saying this human was legally justified in her actions?" "I'm saying that if you breach that room and harm either of the humans inside, the Legal Review Board will spend the next 10 years investigating every decision you've made. And the Human Defense Fleet ships that just arrived will have significant concerns about how their citizens have been treated." In the room, Marcus and Sarah heard the sudden cessation of preparation sounds outside their door. Voices were raised in what sounded like an argument, though they couldn't make out the specific words. "Something's changed," Marcus observed. Sarah nodded, but kept her weapon ready. "Could be a trick, or it could be that someone in authority finally looked at the legal situation and realized they're in deeper trouble than they thought." 5 minutes later, the door chimed again. This time, the voice that followed was different, calmer, and speaking in more diplomatic tones. "Occupants, this is Station Administrator Veltar. I would like to request a peaceful dialogue to resolve this situation. Dr. Kethrel from the Ethics Board is here and has raised significant concerns about the circumstances of your detention. We would like to discuss these matters." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. This was better than being stormed by security, but it could still be a trap. "Administrator," Sarah called out, "I want to speak directly with the human fleet commander who just arrived, and I want Dr. Kethrel present as a witness to everything that's said." "That can be arranged," Veltar replied after a moment. "Admiral Chun has indicated her willingness to participate in negotiations." Admiral Jennifer Chun materialized in the station's main conference room via holographic projection 20 minutes later. The sight of her in full military dress uniform, flanked by her senior officers, seemed to make a significant impression on the assembled consortium officials. "Administrator Veltar," she began without preamble, "I understand you have 2 of my citizens in your custody. I'd like to speak with them immediately to verify their condition and circumstances." "Of course, Admiral," Veltar replied, though his nervous manner suggested he was beginning to understand the political dimensions of the situation. "However, I should point out that one of them has committed serious crimes aboard this station." "What I've been told," Jennifer replied coldly, "is that you've been holding a human citizen as an experimental subject for 3 months without proper consent or legal authorization. From my perspective, any actions taken to escape illegal imprisonment would be considered self-defense." Professor Vextai, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. "Admiral, with respect, the subject was captured during a violent conflict and brought here under proper research protocols. We've been conducting valuable scientific studies that benefit the entire galactic community." Jennifer turned her attention to the Zephyrian professor, and her expression became even more glacial. "Professor, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Human citizens are not experimental subjects. They're not specimens to be studied. They are people with rights and freedoms that are recognized by every civilized member of the Galactic Consortium. If you have treated any human as anything less than a sapient being deserving of respect and dignity, then You have committed crimes that will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of consortium law. The silence that followed was profound. Every alien in the room was suddenly confronted with the possibility that their understanding of humans was fundamentally flawed. These weren't primitive creatures driven by instinct and aggression. They were a sophisticated species with their own concepts of justice, dignity, and proper conduct. Now, Jennifer continued, I want to speak with both humans immediately, and I want a full accounting of every procedure, test, and examination that has been conducted. Because depending on what I find, this station may be looking at formal charges of torture, illegal detention, and crimes against sapient beings. Dr. Kethrel stepped forward. Admiral, I've been reviewing the documentation, and I believe you'll find sufficient evidence to support all of those charges. The question is how we move forward in a way that serves justice while preserving the educational and diplomatic mission of this station. Jennifer nodded slowly. Doctor, I appreciate your position, but I think everyone in this room needs to understand something about humans. We don't seek conflict, but we absolutely will not tolerate the abuse of our people. What happens next depends entirely on how seriously you take that principle. As if summoned by her words, Marcus and Sarah entered the conference room, escorted by station security, but clearly not under arrest. Sarah still carried herself with the alert wariness of someone who had spent months in captivity, while Marcus looked like a young man who had just discovered that the academic world was far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Jennifer's expression softened as she saw her brother, but her voice remained professionally controlled. Mr. Chun, Miss Chun, are you both unharmed? Physically, yes, Sarah replied. Though I think we need to have a very serious conversation about what's been happening here and what it means for human consortium relations going forward. Indeed we do, Jennifer agreed. And I think that conversation is going to change how a lot of people think about humanity's place in the galaxy. Professor Vextai watched the exchange with growing unease. Everything he thought he knew about humans was being challenged by what he was seeing. These weren't savage predators driven by instinct. They were organized, disciplined, and operating within a sophisticated understanding of law and diplomacy. If he had been wrong about their fundamental nature, then everything else he had taught might be wrong as well. More troubling still was the realization that his research might have created exactly the kind of conflict he had been trying to help the consortium prepare for. If word of human mistreatment spread, it could destabilize the fragile peace that everyone had been working to maintain. As the various parties settled in for what was clearly going to be a long and difficult negotiation, one thing became clear to everyone in the room. The galaxy was about to learn a great deal more about human nature than they had bargained for. The negotiations that followed would later be studied in diplomatic academies across the galaxy as a masterclass in crisis resolution. Admiral Jennifer Chun had positioned herself carefully, making it clear that while humanity sought justice, they were not interested in escalating the situation into a larger conflict. Sarah's testimony about her 3 months in captivity painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse disguised as scientific research. She described procedures that had tested her pain tolerance, psychological breaking points, and physical limitations. Much of it had been conducted under the guise of medical examination, but the underlying purpose was clearly to gather intelligence that could be used against humans in future conflicts. They wanted to know how much pressure we could take before we broke, she explained to the assembled officials. Not just physical pressure, but psychological. They studied our responses to isolation, fear, and despair. They documented everything, how we react to threats against loved ones, what kinds of environments cause us the most distress, which emotions they could exploit to control our behavior. Professor Vextai shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When presented in this context, his research did indeed sound more like preparation for war than academic study. Professor, Admiral Chen addressed him directly. I'd like to understand your perspective on these activities. What was the ultimate goal of your research? Vextai struggled to find words that would justify what now seemed indefensible. Admiral, the consortium has concerns about human expansion and militarization. We needed to understand your species' capabilities and limitations in order to maintain galactic stability. By torturing one of our citizens. It wasn't torture, Vextai protested weakly. It was scientific observation designed to prevent future conflicts. Professor, Dr. Kethril interjected, I've reviewed your research protocols. You conducted invasive procedures without consent, subjected your test subject to deliberately induce stress and pain, and maintained her in solitary confinement for extended periods. By any definition of civilized conduct, these actions constitute torture. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Several of the consortium officials looked genuinely disturbed as they began to understand the full implications of what had been done in their name. Administrator Veltar cleared his throat nervously. Admiral Chun, on behalf of the Andromeda Educational Station and the Consortium Research Authority, I want to express our sincere regret for any inappropriate treatment your citizen may have experienced. However, I hope you understand that Professor Vextai was acting within his authorized research parameters. Jennifer's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see the dangerous glint in her eyes that he remembered from their childhood. His sister was reaching the limits of her diplomatic patience. Administrator, Jennifer replied carefully, let me help you understand the human perspective on this situation. You have admitted that you captured one of our citizens under false pretenses, held her against her will for 3 months, and subjected her to procedures that your own ethics board has classified as torture. From our standpoint, these are acts of war. The silence that followed was absolute. Every alien in the room suddenly understood that they were no longer dealing with an academic disagreement or even a criminal matter. They had stumbled into a diplomatic crisis that could affect the stability of the entire galactic community. However, Jennifer continued, and the relief in the room was palpable. Humanity recognizes that these actions may have been taken out of fear rather than malice. We're willing to work toward a resolution that serves justice while preserving the relationships we've all worked to build. Administrator Veltar leaned forward eagerly. What would such a resolution look like, Admiral? First, full accountability for what happened here. Every official who authorized or participated in Ms. Chen's mistreatment will face appropriate consequences. Second, comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Third, reparations to Ms. Chun for what she's endured. And fourth, a formal apology from the consortium acknowledging that this treatment was unacceptable. And in return, Veltar asked, in return, we agree to treat this as a learning experience rather than an act of war. We work together to develop better protocols for interspecies research and education. And we demonstrate to the galaxy that civilized beings can resolve even serious conflicts through dialogue and mutual respect. Professor Vextai spoke up hesitantly. Admiral, if I may ask, what would have happened if we had refused these terms? Jennifer's smile was cold as winter. Professor, you've spent months studying human nature. What do you think would have happened? The question hung in the air as Vextai contemplated his research findings. Humans, he had concluded, were remarkably protective of their own kind. They would fight overwhelming odds to defend family members, friends, or even complete strangers of their species. They formed emotional bonds that transcended rational cost-benefit analysis. You would have come for her, he said quietly. We would have come for her, Jennifer confirmed. And we would have brought enough firepower to level this station if necessary. The ships you see outside are just the diplomatic escort. The real fleet is waiting 2 jump points away. The implications of her words rippled through the room. Several of the consortium officials began checking their personal communicators, presumably to verify the truth of her statement. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and concern as he realized just how seriously the human defense fleet took the protection of its citizens. Dr. Kethril broke the tense silence. Admiral, I believe your terms are reasonable and just. Speaking as a representative of the Academic Ethics Board, I recommend their immediate acceptance. I agree, said Commander Thexmal of the Caraxian Security Forces, surprising everyone in the room. The actions taken against this human were dishonorable by any standard. Justice demands accountability. One by one, the other officials voiced their agreement. Administrator Veltar, recognizing that he had little choice in the matter, formally accepted Admiral Chen's terms on behalf of the station and the Consortium Research Authority. The next several hours were spent working out the details of implementation. Professor Vextai would face formal charges and removal from his position. The research data gathered from Sarah's captivity would be destroyed under oversight from human observers. Comprehensive new protocols will be developed for any future research involving sapient beings, with mandatory consent procedures and ethical oversight. Sarah herself would receive full medical treatment for any lasting effects of her captivity, financial compensation for her suffering, and transportation to any human colony of her choosing. She would also have the option to pursue additional legal remedies through consortium courts if she so chose. As the formal agreements were being drafted, Marcus found himself in a quiet corner of the conference room with Sarah and his sister. It was the first chance they'd had a talk privately since the crisis began. "So," Sarah said with a tired smile, "this has been an interesting way to meet the family. I take it diplomatic incidents are a regular feature of Chun family gatherings?" Jennifer laughed despite the stress of the situation. "You'd be surprised how often Marcus manages to find himself in the middle of interstellar crises. I was hoping his education would keep him out of trouble for a while." "To be fair," Marcus protested, "I didn't go looking for this one. It found me." "It found both of us," Sarah agreed. "The question is, what happens now? I mean, beyond the official agreements and paperwork. What does this mean for humans in the galaxy?" Jennifer considered the question carefully. "I think it means we've just moved past the honeymoon phase of human consortium relations. Up until now, most species have been dealing with their fantasies about what humans are like rather than the reality. This crisis forced everyone to confront the actual facts about our nature, both good and bad." "And what do they learn?" Marcus asked. "That we're not the mindless predators some of them feared," Sarah replied. "But we're also not harmless. We're people, complicated, emotional, protective people who will go to extraordinary lengths for each other. Is that good or bad for our future in the galactic community?" "Both," Jennifer said honestly. "Some species will respect us more now that they understand we're not going to be pushed around. Others will fear us more because they realize we can't be easily controlled or manipulated. The real challenge will be proving that we can be trusted with the responsibility that comes with being taken seriously." Professor Vextai approached their group hesitantly, his crystalline features showing an expression that might have been shame. "Ms. Chun," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize personally for what you endured. I convinced myself that I was serving the greater good, but I understand now that I was simply acting out of fear and prejudice." Sarah studied him for a long moment before responding. "Professor, I appreciate the apology, but what matters now is what you do with what you've learned. You have a choice. You can let this experience make you more afraid of humans, or you can let it teach you that fear is a poor foundation for understanding. What would you recommend?" Vextai asked. "Get to know us as individuals rather than specimens," Sarah replied. "Spend time with human students and faculty. Learn about our cultures, our philosophies, our dreams for the future. You might discover that we're not so different from other sapient species after all." Vextai nodded dogfootfully. "I would welcome such an opportunity if you think humans would be willing to work with someone who has treated your species so poorly." "Professor," Marcus interjected, "one thing you should understand about humans is that we believe in second chances. We've made plenty of mistakes ourselves throughout our history. What matters is whether you learn from this experience and do better going forward." As the formal proceedings concluded and the various parties prepared to return to their duties, Dr. Kethrel made one final observation that would prove remarkably prescient. "Admiral Chun," she said, "I believe this incident, terrible as it was, may ultimately strengthen the relationship between humans and the consortium. Nothing teaches respect like seeing how someone handles a crisis with dignity and restraint." "I hope you're right, Doctor," Jennifer replied, "because the galaxy is a big place, and humanity is just getting started exploring it. We'll need all the friends we can get. as the human ships prepared to depart from the Andromeda Educational Station, carrying Sarah home and leaving Marcus to continue his studies under very different circumstances, the ripple effects of the crisis were already spreading across the galaxy. News of the incident and its resolution would reach every member world within days. The story would be told and retold, analyzed, and debated in council chambers and academy classrooms from the core worlds to the outer rim. Some would focus on the injustice of Sarah's treatment and the necessity of reform. Others would emphasize humanity's measured response and their commitment to peaceful resolution. But perhaps most importantly, the incident would mark the end of the galaxy's ability to think of humans as abstract threats or theoretical problems. They were individuals now, people with names and faces and stories. They could be wronged, and they demanded justice. They could be threatened, and they would respond with overwhelming force if necessary. But they could also forgive, cooperate, and work toward solutions that served everyone's interests. The live specimen that was meant to terrify a xenobiology class had instead taught the galaxy a lesson about the complexity of human nature and the importance of treating all sapient beings with dignity and respect. It was not the last lesson that humanity would teach the galactic community, but it was perhaps the most important one. As the stars wheeled overhead and ships departed for distant worlds carrying news of what had transpired, both Marcus and Sarah found themselves looking forward to a future where such misunderstandings might become increasingly rare. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, and humanity was only beginning to find its place among the stars. 6 months later, Marcus Chin stood before a very different xenobiology class. The same lecture hall, the same tiered seating arrangement, but the atmosphere was completely transformed. Where once there had been fearful whispers and nervous fidgeting, there was now genuine curiosity and engaged discussion. As we can see from this case study, Marcus was saying, addressing the mixed group of students, the key to understanding any species lies not in their capacity for violence, but in the social structures and ethical frameworks that guide their behavior. The irony was not lost on him. 6 months ago, he had sat in this same room listening to Professor Vextai describe humans as primitive killing machines. Now, he was the one teaching the class, having been invited to take over the xenobiology program as part of the station's commitment to educational reform. In the front row, a young, tentacled student raised one of her appendages. Professor Chun, the previous curriculum suggested that human aggression was largely instinctual. But your research indicates it's actually highly regulated by social norms. How do we reconcile these different perspectives? Marcus smiled, remembering when that same student had cowered in fear at the mere mention of human pack hunting behavior. Excellent question, Zelana. The key is to understand that capacity and application are very different things. Humans evolved with significant physical and psychological capabilities for combat. This part of the old curriculum was accurate. However, we've also evolved extremely sophisticated mechanisms for controlling when and how those capabilities are used. He activated a holographic display showing human neural activity patterns during various emotional states. Notice how the regions associated with empathy and social reasoning remain highly active even during high-stress situations. This is what allows humans to distinguish between legitimate threats and non-combatants, to follow rules of engagement even in chaotic circumstances, and to form protective bonds with members of other species. A Caraxian student in the back row spoke up. But, Professor, what about the incidents in the Outer Rim conflicts? Human forces were documented using overwhelming force against superior numbers. Another excellent point, Thexral. Let me show you something. Marcus pulled up incident reports from the conflicts in question, displaying them side by side with the context that had been missing from Professor Vextai's original presentations. Colony defense records, civilian casualty reports, and communication logs that painted a very different picture than the one his students had been taught. Human forces did indeed use what appeared to be overwhelming force. But Notice the specific targeting: military installations, equipment depots, command centers. Very few civilian casualties despite the intensity of the fighting. This is because human military doctrine emphasizes the protection of non-combatants even in the heat of battle. The students absorbed this information with thoughtful expressions. Many of them were taking notes, a far cry from the terrified silence that had characterized classes under the previous instructor. Furthermore, Marcus continued, look at what happened after these conflicts ended. In every case, human forces provided medical aid to wounded enemies, assisted in reconstruction efforts, and worked to establish peaceful relationships with former adversaries. This pattern of behavior is inconsistent with this savage predator model we discussed earlier. Dr. Kethrel, who had been observing the class from the back of the room, stepped forward as the lesson concluded. Over the past 6 months, she had become Marcus's closest collaborator in developing the new curriculum, and her insights have been invaluable. Students, she announced, I want you to prepare for our special presentation next week. We'll be having a guest speaker who can provide first-hand perspective on human nature and interspecies relations. After the students filed out, discussing the day's lesson in animated conversations, Dr. Kethrel approached Marcus with a satisfied expression. They're really beginning to understand, she observed. Not just the facts about humans, but the broader principle of looking beyond surface assumptions to understand the complexities of sapient behavior. It's been remarkable to watch, Marcus agreed. Some of these students were genuinely terrified of humans 6 months ago. Now, they're asking nuanced questions about human psychology and social organization. And what about you? Any regrets about giving up your anonymous student life for a teaching position? Marcus considered the question while looking out at the stars beyond a lecture hall's windows. His original plan had been to complete his education quietly and return to human space with advanced knowledge of galactic science and technology. Instead, he had become one of the most visible human faces in the academic community, representing his species to thousands of students from across the galaxy. No regrets, he said finally. This work feels important. Every student who leaves here with a better understanding of humans is someone who might prevent future misunderstandings. And every misconception we correct here spreads to their home worlds and their future colleagues. Speaking of which, Dr. Kethrel said with a mischievous expression, have you heard the latest reports from the Zephyrian homeworld? What about them? Professor Vextai has been traveling there extensively, speaking to academic and government groups about his revolutionary new understanding of human nature. Apparently, his presentations are drawing enormous audiences. Marcus raised an eyebrow. I hope he's presenting accurate information. From what I understand, his message is quite different from his old lectures. He's been describing humans as complex social beings whose apparent aggression is actually a sophisticated protective mechanism. He's also been advocating for increased cultural exchange programs and collaborative research initiatives. That's not what I expected from him. People can change, Marcus. Sometimes dramatic experiences force us to re-examine our most fundamental assumptions. Professor Vextai learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it thoroughly. Their conversation was interrupted by an incoming communication alert. Marcus activated the display to find Admiral Jennifer Chen's familiar face looking back at him. Hello, little brother. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Never too important for you. Marcus replied with a grin. How are things in the defense fleet? Busy but productive. I'm actually calling with some news that might interest you. The Consortium Council has formally approved the new interspecies research protocols you helped develop. They're being implemented across all member worlds. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. The protocols have been one of his primary projects since taking over the xenobiology program. Comprehensive guidelines for ethical research involving sapient beings, with mandatory oversight and consent procedures. More importantly, Jennifer continued, they've also approved funding for the Human Consortium Cultural Exchange Initiative. We're going to be placing human instructors and researchers at academic institutions throughout the galaxy, while bringing alien students and faculty to human universities. That's incredible news, Marcus said. How did you manage to get approval for something that ambitious? Apparently, the success of your program here has convinced a lot of people that face-to-face interaction is the best way to overcome interspecies prejudice. Several council members specifically cited your work as evidence that educational exchange can prevent conflicts before they start. Dr. Kethrel stepped into the communication frame. Admiral Chun, I want you to know that your brother has been exceptional in this role. His approach to teaching has transformed not just how our students think about humans, but how they approach the study of any unfamiliar species. I'm not surprised, Jennifer replied. Marcus always had a talent for seeing past surface appearances to understand what really motivates people. It's what made him such a good candidate for this mission in the first place. Speaking of which, Marcus said, "How is Sarah doing?" "I haven't heard from her since she started her new assignment." Jennifer's expression became more serious. "She's doing well, actually. Better than we expected. The medical corps has cleared her for full duty, and she's been working with the diplomatic service to develop new protocols for first contact situations. Her experience here has given her insights that are proving invaluable. I'm glad she's found a way to turn what happened into something positive." "That seems to be a recurring theme with this whole situation," Jennifer observed. "What was intended as an act of hostility has become the foundation for unprecedented cooperation. Sarah's ordeal led to reforms that will protect countless other beings from similar treatment. Your cover being blown resulted in educational programs that are changing how species interact across the galaxy. Even Professor Vextai has become an advocate for the very people he once persecuted." After the communication ended, Marcus returned to his office to prepare for the next day's classes. As he reviewed his lesson plans, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he had been trying to hide his humanity while learning about the galaxy. Now he was proudly representing his species while teaching others to look beyond their assumptions and prejudices. The door chimed, and he looked up to see one of his students standing nervously in the entrance. It was Kethis, a young herbivoran who had been among the most frightened during Professor Vextai's original lectures. "Professor Chun," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I wanted to ask you something about next week's presentation." "Of course, Kethis. What's on your mind?" "You mentioned that we would be meeting a human who had direct experience with interspecies conflict. I was wondering, is this person someone who has been in actual combat?" Marcus set down his work and gave her his full attention. "Yes, she is. Is that a concern for you?" Kethis fidgeted with her leaf-like appendages, clearly struggling with her words. "I'm ashamed to admit it, Professor, but the idea still frightens me a little. Even after everything we've learned about human nature, the thought of meeting someone who is killed in battle, it's difficult to process." Marcus nodded understandingly. "Kethis, that's a perfectly natural reaction. Fear of violence is actually a healthy response that helps keep you safe. But I want you to consider something. The human you'll be meeting chose to become a soldier specifically to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Every act of violence she committed was in defense of others. How can you be certain of that?" "Because I know her personally, and because I've studied human military culture extensively. The vast majority of human warriors are motivated by protective instincts, not aggressive ones. They fight because someone needs to, not because they want to." Kethis seemed to consider this. Will she be able to explain how humans reconcile their protective nature with their capacity for violence? That's something I've been struggling to understand. I think she'll be able to give you insights that no academic study could provide. But, Kethis, remember that you're not required to attend if the prospect makes you too uncomfortable. Your emotional well-being is more important than any single lesson." "No," she said with sudden determination. "I want to attend. If humans can find the courage to put themselves in danger to protect others, I can find the courage to confront my own fears to learn about them." As Kethis left his office, Marcus felt a warm sense of accomplishment. This was why the work mattered, not just the facts and theories they taught, but the personal growth and understanding that came from challenging assumptions and overcoming prejudices. A week later, Sarah Chun stood at the front of the same lecture hall where she had once been displayed as a terrifying specimen. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Instead of fear and revulsion, the students showed genuine curiosity and respect. 6 months ago, she began, many of you saw me as a dangerous predator in a cage. Today, I stand before you as a fellow sapient being who has learned as much from this experience as any of you. I want to talk to you about courage, protection, and the choices that define us regardless of our species. For the next 2 hours, she shared her story with remarkable honesty and openness. She described the terror of captivity, the rage of being treated as a laboratory animal, and the temptation to let those emotions drive her toward the very violence that her captors expected. But she also talked about the choice to seek help rather than revenge, to trust in justice rather than resort to brutality. The defining moment, she told the rapt audience, wasn't when I escaped from the research lab. It was when I chose to reach out to Marcus instead of simply trying to hurt everyone who had hurt me. That choice, to seek cooperation rather than revenge, that's what separates civilization from chaos. During the question and answer period that followed, Kethis raised a trembling appendage. MS. Chun, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. How do you control the urge for violence when you've been wronged? How do humans manage to channel their aggressive instincts toward positive ends? Sarah looked at the young herbivoran with compassion, recognizing the courage it took for someone of her species to ask such a question. The same way any sapient being does, she replied gently. We remember what we're fighting for. Humans aren't violent by nature. We're protective by nature. When we fight, we're fighting to preserve something we value. Our families, our communities, our principles. The moment fighting becomes about destruction rather than protection, we've lost our way. But how do you know the difference? By never fighting alone, Sarah said simply. Human military units, human communities, human families, they all provide checks and balances on individual behavior. We hold each other accountable for our actions. We remind each other of our values when emotions run high. And we support each other when the weight of difficult decisions becomes too much to bear alone. As the presentation concluded and the students began to file out, many of them approached Sarah with personal thanks and additional questions. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable, where once they had seen a monster, they now saw a teacher and an inspiration. Later that evening, Marcus, Sarah, Dr. Kethrel, and several other faculty members gathered for an informal dinner to reflect on the day's success. The conversation ranged widely, from specific pedagogical techniques to broader questions about interspecies understanding. Sarah said thoughtfully, 6 months ago, I would have said that the worst thing that could happen to human-alien relations would be for other species to see us as monsters. But I think I was wrong. The worst thing would be for them to see us as saints. Both perspectives dehumanize us by making us something other than what we actually are. Which is? Dr. Kethrel asked. People, Sarah replied simply. Complicated, flawed, sometimes magnificent people who are trying to figure out their place in a vast and often confusing universe, just like everyone else. Marcus raised his glass in a toast. To being people, he said, in all our complexity and contradiction. To being people, the others echoed, and for a moment, the species' differences around the table seemed irrelevant compared to the shared experience of consciousness and curiosity that united them all. Outside the windows of the dining hall, the stars stretched away to infinity, holding countless worlds where countless beings were struggling with the same fundamental questions of identity, purpose, and belonging. The galaxy was vast and full of mysteries, but perhaps the greatest mystery of all was not the nature of distant worlds or alien civilizations, but the simple fact that beings so different from each other could find common ground in their shared desire to understand and be understood. The live specimen who had been meant to terrify a class had instead taught the galaxy a lesson about the power of empathy, the importance of truth, and the possibility of redemption. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries to come, shaping how species approached each other across the vast distances of space and time. And in a small way, it was a lesson that proved something that humans had always believed but rarely had the chance to demonstrate on such a scale: that understanding was always possible, forgiveness was always available, and hope was always justified, no matter how dark the circumstances might seem. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges and opportunities, conflicts and collaborations. But now, at least, it was a future where beings from different worlds could meet as equals, united by their common search for knowledge, meaning, and connection in the vast cosmos they all called home.